December 1944. The Ardennes forest on the border of Belgium and Germany. The Third Reich was launching its final, desperate gamble, Operation Watm Rhine, Watch on the Rhine, known to the Americans as the Battle of the Bulge. The goal was to split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. Hitler had scraped together the last reserves of the Wehrmacht. He sent in the elite SS Panzer divisions and the Volksgrenadiers. On paper, it was a formidable force. Thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of men. But if you looked closer, you saw a starving army. By late 1944, the German supply chain had collapsed. The Allied bombing campaign had destroyed the rail network. The loss of agricultural land in the east meant that food was scarce. The German soldier at the front was hungry. Always hungry. His daily ration had been cut to the bone. He lived on Kommissbrot, a dense, dark bread often extended with sawdust or potato peelings to add bulk. He ate thin soup made from turnips. Meat was a luxury, often horse meat salvaged from artillery teams killed in airstrikes. He was cold. The winter of 1944 was one of the coldest on record. While the propaganda newsreels in Berlin showed healthy, smiling troops, the reality in the foxholes was grim. Soldiers were scavenging. They stole from French farmhouses. They looted the bodies of the dead. The offensive was launched with a strict logistical limit. The tanks had fuel for maybe 3 days. The men carried rations for 2. The entire plan relied on capturing American supply dumps. They weren't just attacking to win ground, they were attacking to eat. General von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, knew this. He looked at his men, gaunt, shivering in their greatcoats, and wondered how long they could fight on empty stomachs. He knew that morale was fragile. A starving man fights desperately, but he does not fight long. The German High Command had told the troops that the Americans were weak. That the U-boats had cut their supply lines. That the GIs were starving too. The German soldier believed this. He had to believe it. It was the only thing that gave him hope, the idea that the enemy was suffering just as much as he was. But deep in the snowy forests of the Ardennes, that illusion was about to be shattered by a chance encounter with a jeep. To understand the shock that was coming, we must understand the world the German soldier lived in. It was the world of Ersatz. Ersatz is the German word for substitute. By 1944, almost everything in Germany was fake. Real coffee had vanished years ago. The soldiers drank Ersatzkaffee, a bitter brew made from roasted acorns, barley, or chicory. It was hot and black, but it provided no caffeine kick. It was a shadow of a drink. Tobacco was rare. German cigarettes were filled with dried leaves, lavender, or worse. They burned hot and tasted like burning garden waste. Uniforms were made of recycled wool and cellulose, wood fiber. When they got wet, they didn't dry, they stiffened. They offered little warmth against the biting wind. Boots were made of synthetic leather or cardboard that fell apart in the snow. Gasoline was synthetic, distilled from coal, because the oil fields of Romania and Russia were lost. Even the soap was gritty clay that didn't lather. The German soldier was fighting for a hollow empire. He was told he was part of the master race, but he was living like a pauper. This scarcity bred a mindset of scavenging. A German unit would stop its advance to strip a dead American of his boots because they were real leather. They would risk their lives to loot a pantry in a Belgian village for a jar of pickled onions. The logistics system was broken. Horse-drawn wagons struggled to bring meager supplies to the front through the snowdrifts. Commanders had to make impossible choices: bring up ammunition or bring up bread. They usually chose ammunition. This meant the soldiers fought on empty stomachs, fueled only by adrenaline and fear. They looked across the lines at the Americans and assumed the situation was similar. After all, it was war. Everyone suffers in war, right? They couldn't imagine a world where supplies were plentiful. They couldn't imagine a world where a waste existed. In the German army, you saved every scrap of paper, every nail, every drop of oil. They were about to collide with an army that threw things away. An army that left half-eaten tins of food in the mud because they didn't like the flavor. The clash between the ersatz reality and the American abundance would be a psychological shockwave that hit harder than any artillery shell. While the Wehrmacht was starving, the US Army was wrestling with a problem the Germans couldn't even conceive of: traffic jams caused by too much stuff. The Red Ball Express, the massive truck convoy system supplying the front, was a river of steel and rubber. The United States had turned logistics into a weapon of mass destruction. The American GI complained about his food. He hated sea rations, cans of stew or hash. He despised K rations, the lighter assault packets. He griped about the endless spam. But to a German observer, the American complaints would have sounded like madness. The American soldier received 4,000 calories a day. He got meat in every meal. Real meat. Beef, pork, chicken. He got chocolate bars. Hard D-ration bars for energy, and sweeter Hershey bars for morale. He got cigarettes. Not made of leaves, but Virginia tobacco. Lucky Strikes, Camels, Chesterfields. He got instant coffee. Powder that turned into a hot, caffeinated drink in seconds. He got toilet paper. He got chewing gum. He got razor blades. And incredibly, he got fresh items from home. The US Army Postal Service was a miracle. It handled millions of letters and packages a month. A mother in Ohio could bake a cake, wrap it in a box, and mail it. Through a complex system of trains, ships, and trucks, that box would cross the Atlantic, cross France, and end up in a foxhole in Belgium. Sometimes in as little as 2 weeks. The arsenal of democracy didn't just build tanks, it baked bread. Behind the American lines, there were mobile bakeries churning out thousands of loaves of white bread every day. There were mobile laundry units. There were mobile showers. The American philosophy was that a comfortable soldier fights better. The German philosophy was that a suffering soldier fights harder. As the Battle of the Bulge began, the Americans were surprised. They were pushed back. In their retreat, they abandoned massive stockpiles of supplies. Fuel dumps with millions of gallons of gasoline. Depots stacked high with winter parkas and overshoes. For the advancing Germans, stumbling upon these dumps was like finding an oasis in the desert. At first, they rejoiced. They gorged themselves on captured rations. They filled their tanks with American gas. But as the initial euphoria faded, a darker realization began to set in. They weren't just stealing food, they were seeing the evidence of their own inevitable defeat. It was the third day of the offensive. A grey, freezing morning. A unit of German Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, attached to the advance guard, was pushing down a narrow forest road. They were elite troops, but they were exhausted. They had been fighting for 72 hours. They were running low on ammo. Their stomachs were cramping with hunger. They spotted an American jeep parked near a crossroads. It had been abandoned in a hurry. The engine was cold, but the vehicle was intact. The German soldiers moved in cautiously, weapons raised. No sign of the enemy. The soldiers relaxed. They swarmed the jeep. Their priority was fuel. They checked the jerry cans on the back. Full. A cheer went up. Then they checked the back seat. There were crates of ammunition. Valuable. There were woolen blankets. Priceless. Then, the colonel commanding the unit arrived. He was a veteran. He had fought in Russia. He had fought in Normandy. He watched his men looting the jeep with a weary expression. One of the soldiers pulled out a canvas mailbag. It was marked U.S. Army Postal Service. The soldiers ripped it open, hoping for cigarettes or valuables. Letters spilled out onto the snow. Packages wrapped in brown paper. The colonel stepped forward. He picked up one of the packages. It was heavy. It was soft. It wasn't military issue. It was a care package from home. He looked at the return address. It was from a civilian address in the United States. He took out his knife and slit the tape. He peeled back the paper. Inside was a cardboard box. And inside the box, protected by wax paper, was a chocolate cake. It wasn't moldy. It wasn't stale. It was fresh. The soldiers gathered around, staring at the dark, rich cake sitting in the colonel's gloved hands. The snow fell silently around them. For a moment, nobody moved. The sight of a fresh chocolate cake in the middle of a war zone was more shocking than a tank. It was an impossible object. And in that moment, the colonel didn't feel hunger. He felt a cold, sinking dread in the pit of his stomach. He was holding the proof that Germany had already lost the war. The colonel didn't stop at the cake. He dug deeper into the canvas sack. It was a treasure trove of the mundane, yet to the German soldiers, it was a glimpse into another universe. He pulled out bundles of letters. V-mail. These weren't the grim, censored, patriotic exhortations that German soldiers received from a bombed-out homeland. These were casual. Happy. He saw photos. A girl on a beach in Florida. A new car in a driveway in Detroit. A family gathering for Thanksgiving with a turkey on the table. The paper quality was good. The ink was fresh. He found a copy of Stars and Stripes newspaper. He found a paperback book, A Council on Books in Wartime edition. He found a pair of knitted socks. Not the rough, grey wool of the Wehrmacht, but soft, colourful yarn. The soldiers around him were sifting through the other packages. One found a carton of fresh eggs packed in sawdust. Another found a razor with replacement blades. In the German army, a razor blade was a precious commodity, sharpened on the inside of a glass until it fell apart. Here, they were disposable. The colonel realized that this wasn't just a supply shipment. This was a morale shipment. The American government wasn't just sending bullets, it was sending home. He looked at his own men. They were ragged. They looked like scarecrows. They hadn't seen their families in years. Their letters home were filled with despair or hollow slogans. The American army treated its soldiers like citizens. The German army treated its soldiers like ammunition, to be used up and discarded. The mailbag was a physical manifestation of the wealth of the enemy. It showed a society that had so much surplus capacity that it could devote shipping space to socks and photos. The colonel knew how hard it was to get a single artillery shell to the front. The rail lines were bombed. The trucks were broken. Yet here was a bag of trivialities that had crossed an ocean and a continent to reach a private first class in a foxhole. It was an insult to the German concept of total war. The Americans were fighting a luxury war. The focus returned to the box in the colonel's hand. The chocolate cake. It was slightly smashed on one side from the journey, but it was undeniably real. The smell wafted up in the cold air. Cocoa. Sugar. Butter. Real butter. For the German soldiers, sugar was a memory. Butter was a myth. They lived on margarine and saccharine. The colonel cut a slice with his combat knife. The crumb was moist. It held together. He tasted it. It was rich and sweet. It tasted of peace. It tasted of a country that wasn't burning. He passed pieces to his men. They ate it reverently, licking the frosting from their dirty fingers. For a moment, the war stopped. They were just men eating cake. But for the colonel, the taste was bitter. He knew what went into a cake like that. It required ingredients from all over the world. Cocoa from the tropics. Sugar from the Caribbean. Wheat from the Midwest. It required a functioning economy. Germany had none of these things. Their trade routes were cut. Their farms were failing. The cake represented the failure of the U-boat campaign. Admiral Donitz had promised that England would be starved. He had promised that no American ship would cross the Atlantic. Yet, here was a cake. If a cake could get through the wolf packs, then anything could get through. If the Americans could ship perishable baked goods, they could ship tanks. They could ship bombers. They could ship the atom bomb, though he didn't know about that yet. The cake was a symbol of logistical dominance. It was a soft, sweet, devastating proof that the Atlantic Ocean was an American highway. The colonel looked at the remaining crumbs. He felt a sudden, overwhelming anger. Not at the Americans, but at his own leaders. They had lied. They had promised victory, but they couldn't even provide bread. The enemy was providing cake. The colonel picked up the brown wrapping paper that had covered the box. He examined the label. It was handwritten. To Corporal Miller, 101st Airborne. But it was the stamp that caught his eye. And the postmark. Boston, Ma. And the date. He wiped his glasses to make sure he was seeing it correctly. The date stamped on the package was only 3 weeks prior. 3 weeks. The colonel did the mental math. A letter mailed from Berlin to the Eastern Front often took 3 months to arrive, if it arrived at all. The German postal service had collapsed under the weight of the bombing. This package had traveled from a kitchen in Boston, to a post office, to a train, to a port. It had been loaded onto a Liberty ship. It had crossed 3,000 miles of the Atlantic Ocean, dodging submarines. It had been unloaded in Cherbourg or Antwerp. It had been sorted by the Army Postal Service. It had been put on a truck, likely a Red Bull Express convoy. It had been driven across France and Belgium. It had been sorted again at a division forward depot. And it had arrived at the front line. In 3 weeks. The speed of the logistics was terrifying. It implied a level of organization that the Wehrmacht could no longer match. It meant the Americans had no bottlenecks. German supply trains waited weeks for coal. German trucks waited days for fuel. The American supply chain was a frictionless pipeline. The postmark was the final piece of evidence. It proved that the U-boat blockade was a lie. It proved that the bombing of American ports was a lie. It proved that the distance between the US and the front line had effectively been erased by logistical competence. The colonel realized that he was fighting an enemy that could project power anywhere in the world, faster than Germany could move troops within its own borders. Boston was closer to the Ardennes than Berlin was. The colonel stood up. He brushed the crumbs from his greatcoat. He looked at his men. They were energized by the sugar, laughing, smoking the captured cigarettes. They were happy. They didn't see the big picture. But the colonel saw the end. He looked at the Tiger tanks of his unit idling nearby. They were formidable machines. Deadly. But they were low on fuel. Their tracks were wearing out. And there were no replacements coming. He looked at the American Jeep. It was just one of millions. He realized that the war was not a contest of courage. The German soldier was brave. The German soldier was skilled. But courage cannot fight logistics. We have lost, he whispered to himself. It wasn't a defeat on the battlefield. It was a defeat in the mailroom. He understood now why the American generals fought the way they did. They didn't need to be brilliant. They just needed to be relentless. They could afford to waste shells. They could afford to waste tanks. They could even afford to waste cakes. Germany was fighting a war of scarcity, counting every bullet. America was fighting a war of abundance, burying the enemy in production. The colonel realized that every time he killed an American, 2 more would arrive. Every time he destroyed a tank, 3 more would be unloaded at Antwerp. It was a mathematical impossibility to win. He felt a heavy, crushing weight on his shoulders. He ordered his men to mount up. They had to keep moving. They had orders to capture the Meuse River bridges. But the fire had gone out of him. He knew that no matter how hard he fought, no matter how many battles he won tactically, the strategic outcome had been decided in a factory in Detroit and a bakery in Boston. He climbed into his command vehicle. He lit an American cigarette. He took a deep drag. It tasted smooth. Rich. Enjoy it, he told his driver. It is the taste of the victors. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another month. thousands more would die. But for one German colonel on a lonely road in the Ardennes, the war ended the moment he tasted that chocolate cake. The news spread through the German ranks like wildfire. It wasn't official news. It wasn't broadcast on the radio. It was whispered in the foxholes and passed along with the loot. The unit that captured the jeep shared the wealth. Other units captured other dumps. Suddenly, German soldiers who hadn't had a decent meal in months were sitting in the snow, smoking Lucky Strikes, drinking Nescafe, and eating canned peaches. The smell of real coffee wafted through the forest. It was the smell of the enemy. At first, the reaction was joy. A full belly is a wonderful thing in winter. But then came the demoralization. Soldiers would sit, smoking the rich American tobacco, and look at their own pathetic cigarettes made of dried leaves. They would compare their lice-ridden, thin uniforms to the thick wool of the captured GI jackets. The contrast was too stark to ignore. The propaganda from Berlin had told them the Americans were soft, decadent, and suffering from the U-boat blockade. The evidence in their hands proved it was a lie. If they are soft, one German sergeant asked, why do they have better boots than we do? If the U-boats are winning, how did this coffee get here? The capture of American supplies didn't strengthen the German army, it rotted it from within. It forced the average soldier to confront the reality that they were fighting a war against a nation of limitless resources. They realized they were the poor relations of the conflict. Despair began to set in. Not panic, but a deep, cynical exhaustion. Why fight? Why die for a government that couldn't feed you, while the enemy was eating cake? Desertions increased. Soldiers would slip away into the night, hoping to surrender to the Americans, not just to save their lives, but to get a hot meal. The psychological impact of the American cornucopia was a weapon more powerful than any bomb. It broke the soldier's faith in his own cause. Back in Berlin, the propaganda machine was still churning. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, knew the situation was desperate. He had to keep the German people fighting. The newsreels showed only victories. They showed German tanks advancing. They showed captured American prisoners, carefully selected to look frightened or unshaven. They never showed the American supply dumps. When rumors of the American abundance began to filter back to Germany in soldiers' letters, the regime clamped down. Letters were censored. Soldiers caught spreading the defeatist talk about American rations were executed. The regime doubled down on the lie. They claimed that the items found were propaganda plants left by the Americans to trick the German soldiers. They claimed the coffee was poisoned. But you can't tell a starving man that the food he is eating isn't real. The reality on the ground in the Ardennes was a refutation of the entire Nazi worldview. The Nazis believed in will. They believed that the superior German spirit would overcome material disadvantages. The mailbag and the cake proved that materialism wins. The lie became unsustainable. German commanders at the front stopped reading the situation reports from Berlin. They knew they were fiction. They had to plan battles based on the reality of what they could scrounge, not on the promises of a delusional high command. The gap between the propaganda and the reality widened until it swallowed the entire German war effort. The Nazi regime had built its power on a foundation of lies, but in the winter of 1944, the truth arrived in a cardboard box from Boston. While the infantry gorged on cake, the panzer divisions were starving for their own kind of food, gasoline. The entire Ardennes offensive was premised on capturing American fuel dumps. The German tanks carried enough fuel for about 300 miles. They needed to get to Antwerp. It was a race against time. And they lost. The American defenders, realizing the German plan, began to burn their own fuel dumps before retreating. Millions of gallons of precious gasoline went up in smoke in the Belgian forests. The German tank commanders watched the black pillars of smoke on the horizon with despair. By the end of December, the offensive had stalled. Not because of American resistance, though it was fierce at places like Bastogne, but because the German tanks ran dry. The most powerful tanks in the world, the Tiger IIS, the Panthers, became useless steel pillboxes. Their crews, who were the elite of the Wehrmacht, had to abandon their machines. They walked back toward Germany on foot. The roads were lined with abandoned German heavy equipment, perfect condition, out of gas. Meanwhile, the American jeeps and trucks were zipping around, fueled by the seemingly endless supply pipeline from the coast. The contrast was the final nail in the coffin. The German army had the will to fight. It had the weapons. But it didn't have the logistics. The American army had everything. The colonel who found the cake knew this was coming. He knew that an army that can mail a cake can also move gasoline. An army that cannot provide bread will also fail to provide fuel. It was all connected. The failure of the German state was total. When the history of World War II is written, the battles get the headlines. D-Day, Stalingrad, Midway. But the war was won and lost in the warehouses, the shipyards, and yes, the mailrooms. The story of the chocolate cake is the perfect distillation of this truth. Germany, a nation of military genius, was defeated by a nation of industrial managers. The American genius was not on the battlefield. It was in the supply chain. It was the ability to produce so much stuff that the enemy simply drowned in it. General Eisenhower famously said, "Battles, campaigns, and even wars have been won or lost primarily because of logistics." The German colonel in the Ardennes understood this in a visceral, emotional way that no strategic briefing could convey. He tasted the defeat. He realized that he was fighting against a system, not just an army. A system that could take a luxury item, a perishable good, and deliver it across a war-torn world with the regularity of the morning mail. Germany had no answer for this. They could build better tanks. They could have better generals. But they couldn't build a better supply chain. And in modern, industrial warfare, the supply chain is the ultimate weapon. The chocolate cake was a small, sweet symbol of a massive, undeniable truth. The arsenal of democracy didn't just outproduce the Axis, it outdelivered them. And in the cold, hungry winter of 1944, that was the only victory that mattered.